the new heroes of this era, and the return of the scientist in parts of the world, and science as an important anchor of public life, which had been very much sort of contested in the era of rising populism. And together with my colleagues, we're constantly looking for ways to break down what's happening and inform the world about how COVID, which is something we're all grappling with, is affecting communities, economies, individuals around Europe and around the world. That's not a really easy thing to do with a 1.5-year-old at home, when you can't really leave home to report. I can't travel. The Times is one of the few papers in the world that still has a generous travel budget, and we're able to commit resources normally to reporting stories out. If I need to go to Croatia, or if I need to go to Germany, or even if I need to go outside of Europe to report a story, if the story is good, the Times will support me in doing that. Now, even if I wanted to, I probably couldn't. And we've had to also really consider the cost benefit of doing on the ground reporting on anything, including Belgium itself, where I live, and take into account the risks of exposure to the virus in the process of reporting. That means, as with most professionals working from home, that your perception of the world becomes skewed. For communications professionals, you're a bit of a sitting duck. If you come and tell me, here's this amazing story that I'm going to help you report on that's happening somewhere you may not have access to, that's already adding something to my day that's unusual, that's different. I know that there's probably a lot of pressure to bend your causes and your topics to fit the COVID narrative, to find COVID angles. And I'm sure in some of your cases that's relevant, and it's a natural thing that's happening. But in other cases, it may not be. And one thing I did want to share with you before we start engaging in more of a dialogue and taking your questions is that right now, actually, today is the first day I heard from an editor, we are desperate for non-COVID stories. Until now, we were being told that, it's good to build a pipeline of stories that are not COVID related. And we've certainly been running news stories that are not COVID related, and a few pieces of so-called enterprise feature writing. But it's been clear that the majority of our firepower has really focused on COVID. If my editors think that we want some known COVID stories in the mix, it probably means that readers really are looking for some non-COVID stories. And so I think that should hopefully ease the pressure on communications professionals and campaigners to try and find some convoluted COVID angle to everything, which, has led to some pretty epic communications failures, I must say. So I think that's also a real opportunity that both reporters and readers, while really keen to stay on top of coronavirus news and developments, they also are now seeking a little bit of respite, a little bit of a change, and a sense of return to normalcy and understanding the world. And I think that's something that's definitely quite significant at the moment. Let me just stop at that and let you guys ask me some questions, or maybe Joe or Julia want to ask some questions, and we can always go back to me talking for long periods of time, which I don't mind terribly, but I'd rather answer some questions that go to the heart of your concerns and things that are on your mind.
Sure. Thanks ever so much, Matina, for that introduction. So yes, as we said earlier, and other people might have joined since, do put in the chat your questions, and then I will ask them, and then we can get a good dialogue going. Thank you very much. I guess just whilst people are thinking of their questions, one of the things I was going to ask you to expand a bit on. So as you were saying, the news desk today, one of the big questions that was coming through before was, yes, you know, my organisation, just before the COVID pandemic exploded into the awful thing that it has, a particular issue, or, you know, we are working on climate change and we are not now sure what to do with certain issues that we're working on, or migration, which obviously is certainly not solved and is still ongoing, the migration crisis. So I guess when your desk is now asking you, please, can you give us some non-COVID stories? What exactly do you think they're asking for there? Are they asking for light relief, or, you know, because normally CSOs are obviously talking about other extremely serious issues. So I guess, can you give us some pointers on what the desk's really asking for there, and also how they put it
and if you have any pointers on what the desk wants, please let me know. No, seriously though, I think a bit of both. I mean, the light relief issue is a bit more to do with the nature of the publication. I know that the British press, for example, has much more of a home for the so-called light relief stories. We are, you know, can be slightly more kind of take ourselves a bit more seriously, perhaps sometimes, than we should. But nonetheless, for example, on the Daily, which is our daily podcast, we've been seeing a lot more content related, which isn't light per se, but is more like reading of longer essays. We have the weekend edition, which is obviously a lot of culture, etc. And the Times is a vast publication with loads of reporters, and we have all of that. I think what my editors are looking for from the international, from the correspondents, is not necessarily that. I think it's two things. One is, sure, something that's more kind of vignette related, more personal, how people are experiencing the world, but it's also back to our normal diet. Our mission is, you know, to help our readers understand the world, and we do that by holding the powerful to account, by bearing witness. Unfortunately, in the physical sense, we are severely limited in bearing witness right now. And I feel that there is a sense of renewed urgency to our doing so, even remotely, best we can. And we can really go into what that means. I've actually been through reporting two stories, non-COVID stories, that really made me understand how difficult it is to do this and without being able to have access to your subject. But I think what they mean is we gotta partly at least devote our resources, our time, to reporting on the things we normally would report on, which include pushbacks and the hiring of private boats in Malta to push back refugees, involve, our climate change coverage has not really abated at all. If anything, kind of dovetails as well with issues of recovery post-COVID, and everything in between that obviously includes a lot of the issues that you guys are interested in.
That's good to know. Joe, you wanted to ask a question?
Yeah, hey Matina. I mean, I have to say it was a really cool, powerful front cover of the newspaper on the weekend. That was really, really strong and amazing. No other newspaper in Europe I've seen who've done that, brought that humanity and dignity to the front page. I don't know if everybody saw that. That was really listing just 1%, I think it was, or 0.1% of the people who've died, and actually a really interesting, really human fact about them and how they live their lives, whether they spent 35 years singing in the choir or whatever. So the New York Times traditionally is a paper that kind of talks straight, I guess, has that reputation. But can you maybe just give a little bit of a flavor of, like, you know, because we're all in Brussels in the bubble, we're kind of used to maybe dealing with a lot of different press from a lot of different countries, as well as some kind of EU press, and there's not many of them, let's say. But what's your real angle of the paper? I mean, maybe you can just give a bit of insight of, like, what is it you really do and what is it you really look for? Is it investigative reporting? What kind of angles, what kind of stories, and what kind of frames do you like to, I mean, not just you, but the paper in general, what are you looking for really in Brussels?
Right, sure. Well, so, I mean, our Brussels setup is really, I mean, quite unique, and we don't have what one might call, we don't have the single correspondent model, but we also don't have the type of newsroom that, you know, let's say Bloomberg or Politico, or even like, you know, so the wires might have here, where people have beats. So there's three of us here, and as well as our wonderful news assistant who puts up with the three of us. And Stephen Erlanger is our chief diplomatic correspondent in Europe. He's, you know, a sort of living legend of journalism, 35 years in the New York Times, and he writes a lot about diplomacy and defense, but certainly about other issues as well, including the rule of law. And he has a real interest in the Western Balkans from his Balkan War coverage days. So Steve writes columns, but he reports very deeply and is very, very analytical and brings just this incredible depth of knowledge and experience to the beat. My colleague Matt Apuzzo, who's based here as well, is as Steve is, a 2-time Pulitzer Prize winner, who is an investigative correspondent. He's one of our, he kind of, it works for Foreign, so works with us, but he also belongs to the global investigations team. And his focus, he was behind the Common Agriculture Policy series of stories in the second half of 2019, which unveiled corruption as well as environmental degradation caused by Common Agriculture Policy funds. And he spent about 9 months working on that story. So this is kind of his thing. And he, at the moment, of course, he's very focused on COVID. And I'm your kind of more traditional Brussels correspondent. So I certainly understand, but try to avoid the very inside baseball issues around EU institutions politics. So, you know, you won't read a story by me that talks about infighting between this bit of the commission and that bit of the parliament and all of that stuff, although we do like to mark big moments in the European Union institutions. For example, of course, when we had our new leadership in the institutions was elected, and you know, sort of when big commission proposals come through, certainly when we have big policy issues at stake, environmental policy, or, you know, this week with the recovery fund, issues around economic policy are very significant because of course the size and the importance of the European Union, especially as global leadership is in such flux. But I guess the angles are more, how shall I put it, are stories that relate to how power is used and abused, and that resonate with readers globally. That means that we're interested in rule of law issues, migration, the environment. We're interested in transatlantic relations. Of course, we're very deeply interested in the role of Russia and China in the world. So that's more kind of geopolitical, geostrategic, geoeconomic issues. The New York Times distinguishes itself both for writing about those very eloquently with investigative prowess, but also about bringing human stories to our readers. So, this week I'm working on a story that involves an elderly gentleman in southern Belgium, and I'm working on a story that involves great power competition as it's playing out in Brussels. If that helps you, I'm glad. It's a very mixed world. We're definitely interested in Brexit, for example. But personally, I am very interested in how the European Union projects its power globally. I'm interested particularly in aid and development, and that's informed by my 5 years in East Africa, where I saw the other end of those policies, migration as well, as I mentioned earlier. And we're also always perennially interested in issues of privacy and how technology is changing our lives. So it's a long list, but I do hope that kind of helps.
Yes, absolutely. I was just wondering also, maybe just before Julia, I mean, there's a few questions in the chat, but I just have one more question to you, if I can just add a follow-up, which is, like, what's the reputation of the newspaper? I mean, it has a lot of history. What kind of, what is it born into? What is its kind of values of the paper? Maybe just share that a little bit for those who don't know. Thanks.
Sorry, the values of the paper?
Yeah, kind of, we have, the ones that we know in Europe more. I mean, we know more like The Guardian, that has kind of a left wing, but much more, we have other newspapers like Financial Times, more economic, although they're getting a little bit more. So what's the kind of, what's the
very,
feel of
very,
the paper?
sure. Very unlike the British model. I think, and that would probably be the case in American journalism, so the Wall Street Journal, the Times, and the Post. I would say there's a very strong divide between the newsroom and the opinion pages. So it's really fascinating how differently news stories are written in the American and the British press. Pure adjectives in the American press. But I like adjectives as much as the next person, don't get me wrong. So I would say that we report straight, we report what's happening. I mentioned a few issues earlier that are key to our coverage. And then I think the reputation of the opinion pages is that they're so-called liberal in the American sense. I'm not sure what that means and how that translates in the European sense. But certainly the opinion pages of the New York Times have become much more diverse in terms of the views they express. And yeah, I mean, that's kind of pretty much all I can say on that.
Okay, great. That gives us a really nice feel for exactly liberal, diverse. I mean, having that front page, I think, says a lot already for those who those on the call who didn't see it. It's really worth checking that out. Julia, did you want to? I thought you you had a question you wanted to raise.
Well, I was going to pass couple of questions on from participants here that have come up in the chat. So maybe shall I give you a couple of questions and then you can answer them one at a time? Is that all right? So first of all, from Emma, and I think this is a bit related to what we were saying earlier. So Emma, I'm working for an NGO in Northern Ireland after being a media officer in the Brussels bubble for 4 years. Would love to hear Matina's ideas on how to navigate and get coverage for human rights topics right now without looking tone deaf. I don't know if that is linked to the question about not COVID related. I think is that right, Emma? You can say, but I think I'm assuming that's what that one means. So that's one question. And then another question as well from Prima, who says, on the upcoming recovery response of the EU Commission, how would you cover its impact on specific demographics, for instance, children? So Prima works for Eurochild, a pan-European advocacy network, who will be analysing the COVID response and its impact on children. And she can share her. So a couple of questions there.
Right. So regarding human rights issues, but it's not just human rights, frankly. Everyone, I feel like, look, people are pretty stressed out and everyone is very sensitive. And I think that there's a big concern of people coming across as, you know, promoting things that are irrelevant or superfluous, or, you know, oh, everyone's dealing with COVID. There they are again talking about LGBTQ rights. And God, you should see my Twitter mentions. It is brutal. You know, I'm maybe writing something about migration and I'll get like, you know, hundreds of tweets saying, who cares? We're dealing with something here at home that's much more important and they can go sort it out themselves. You're always going to be getting these responses. The reality is that human rights issues are just as pressing as there's ever been, if not more, because this opaqueness and the inability to observe what's happening out in the world right now is probably leading to many more human rights abuses that we have no bloody, like, that's what keeps me up at night. What are they doing when we're not watching because we can't? That makes your role, if anything, even more important. For myself here, I don't represent my own, I represent, but it is a new opportunity to say, hey, look, this is happening. I know because I have access to this topic. Let me tell you more about it. Where I do think your job becomes harder is that, you know, a lot of reporters need a lot of help from communications professionals who work in the field or who work with organizations that represent NGOs, for example. And, you know, I think right now there's going to be a bigger demand on you to not only aware that something is happening and deserves their attention, but also helping them report it. That means approaching someone not just with a story idea that you think they're the right person to look at, but also with offers of specific interviews, offers of evidence, offers of, you know, help reporting something out, which you may think is obvious, but the reporter needs to effectively reverse engineer what you're telling them is happening. They need to go through the information and independently verify it. So that's something that's an opportunity right now. Not to be tone deaf, honestly, because we're currently not in offices. And often we miss out on those informal conversations of, hey, I was thinking of putting this title on my email. What do you think? Does that sound weird to you, or does that sound about right? Is the tone right? Try and basically crowd test it. Call your colleagues and say, hey, this is what I'm thinking. Do you see anything wrong with this? Do you see any problems? Do you see by any stretch of fairness that this could be construed as you know, tone deaf or irrelevant in this context? And I think that's a really good place to start. Sorry, and then there was the question about specific interest groups within the recovery. So again, I mean, one issue I always have is if you're knocking on my door and you're saying, you know, within your coverage of the recovery, this particular group of the population really deserves additional attention. What I'm going to ask is real life human beings with a lot of information that I can get from them that explain why they are in a particularly different, precarious situation. The reality is, you know, our societies can be split into myriads of subgroups across gender lines, across age lines, across wealth lines, professionally, etc. So when something this huge and cataclysmic, it's fascinating to see how different groups within society are impacted more. But what I would want to find out more there is, tell me why the group that you represent is different and interesting, beyond the fact that we're all, in a very difficult situation, and we're all looking to this recovery package or recovery efforts by individual governments for an across-the-board improvement of conditions.
Okay, thanks, Martina. I got a couple of other questions. It's Joe here. You can't see me, but I can see you. I posted a picture of you on Twitter as well, so with a hashtag, looking beautiful. So we got a question from Sebastian here. He says, "Hi, Sebastian here from Liberties, a human rights network working on the rule of law inside the EU. Question to Martina: when you write your pieces, who is your primary audience? People in the US or a more international English-speaking community worldwide?"
God, this Zoom is going to send me into an existential crisis. I really don't know. Well, everyone, we definitely write, step back. The New York Times, I think at this point, has about 6 million subscribers. The vast majority of them are in the US, of course. And number 2 and number 3 are Anglophone countries, Canada and the United Kingdom. Fundamentally, we remain an American newspaper, but certainly globally ambitious, and increasingly we are read across the world, and especially when it comes to stories that local readers feel are not well covered by the local press. That's very important, especially in the area that you work in. For example, our work on Hungary and Poland has been distinguished because the local press, precisely because of these conditions, is just so threatened and so stifled that what we bring is, the freedom of not living in those countries and not being subject to the types of pressures that the press in those countries face. So when we write those stories, you will definitely see paragraphs that might make you cringe as a European who knows quite a lot. They might seem oversimplifying or simplistic, a lot of context. You might even find some parts of the story referring to the American experience or comparing to it, and that's necessary to keep our American audience engaged, and they are, top of mind. But increasingly, we feel that those stories can be read well without redundancy and without lack of detail across the world. And in some cases, especially where we feel that there's a public service element to the country that we're writing about, we also have the capability to have it translated in that language. So for example, going back to Matapuzzo's Common Agricultural Policy investigation with our colleague Selam Gebrekidan, the story that examined the corruption elements, I believe, was translated into Czech because a lot of it was about the Czech Republic, and was, we saw the readership in the Czech Republic explode, and people consumed it and read it, and it was picked up in the local press, just as it was getting read by thousands and thousands of dozens of thousands of people in America. It's a constant struggle, and myself not being an American, I sometimes, find it a bit more challenging to bridge those worlds. But that's where our editors also come in to help us have those stories that read well on both sides of the Atlantic.
Thanks a lot, Martina, for that. I just had one question, a follow-up, really to that answer, and also earlier. You were talking about what you're looking for, and talking about sort of some bad examples, I guess, where people have been trying to find any COVID hook they possibly can and bending issues into it in some cases, and in other cases our issues are very relevant. What is it that's coming into your inbox at the moment? So like you said, we can't meet for coffee. There's so many. I mean, do you have time for phone chats? Is there particular things in titles that come into your inbox? Basically, what is it that, I guess, what are the top tips for something that will make you open that email, make it stand out? And do you prefer to have a chat with people these days, or
Definitely.
best way to approach you?
Yeah, so I mean, definitely. So what I said at the top, and actually it's even more the case now, but it's always been the case, has been an email that sort of acknowledges that, you know, how shall I put it? That the person who's writing to me hasn't written the exact same email to a million other people. That takes into account that they understand my publication and have had a look at a few New York Times reporters and have concluded that I'm the right person to go to for whatever reason. Happens a lot with migration issues where I get a lot of emails with legitimate tips or stories or input on migration. And because people know I write about this a lot, I may not end up writing a story, but you've got, you know, as a communications professional, for example, that you've written a message to a person who is interested because you've done some research and you know this, and therefore is more likely to pay attention to your email, follow up with a chat. And if I'm inundated, I will then make the extra effort to forward it along to another colleague who may be able to read it and do something about it. So I think that, I don't know what's more work. Is it more work to sort of write for a huge audience and like ship off an email to 2,000 people? I don't know. Or to spend the time looking for people's bylines and looking for publications that are better calibrated to you, offering these exclusives. Do you want to have an exclusive interview with the, you know, the chairman of my NGO who's not a newsmaker? That's not really going to help in this type of story. Calling me and saying, hey, I know you lived in East Africa and you've written about over-indebtedness of East African countries to China. I've got a story for you that's, by the way, I'm totally making this up. It's a completely fictional example. But I've got a story for you that says that, you know, a local community in coastal Kenya is concerned about losing access to this or that because of Chinese debt, and the government is considering, you know, giving the Chinese government a port, access to a port instead of repaying debt. Like, that could very well be, I mean, that could very well actually be a factual situation given the state of the world. But it could also, you could send a generic description of that to 1,000 reporters and get no answers, and you could spend the same amount of time finding 3 correspondents who actually care about this and contacting them in a personal way and saying, I've seen that you've written about these things. I know that you care because I follow you on Twitter, and I know that you often tweet about this. Do you think this is interesting? Would you be interested in talking more about it and about how I can help you write a story?
Sounds great. And we have a little bit, I guess, a follow-up question from Emma to this. And she's saying, do you have a favorite example of good NGO storytelling right now? So probably that is in relation to
I don't, that's a really good question.
it's on the spot, that one.
No, yeah, no, it's a great question though. So look, I mean, I still think that the NGOs that are very strong in storytelling continue being very strong in storytelling. I'm thinking MSF. Of course, okay, they have the sort of, they're very much on their topic here. So I think, yeah, MSF has been particularly strong in that regard in this time. I'm trying to think of anyone else. I think environmental organizations have also had a help in their narrative as these discussions about vast public spending are happening, and there's a renewed call for green economy focus in the efforts to rebuild post-COVID. I can't think of anyone specific right now, but overall. And I certainly feel that anxiety by human rights NGOs, especially regarding the COVID context. I think some privacy NGOs are also quite topical. But you know, here I am telling you that there's time for non-COVID stories, and all the examples I've given you are COVID related, but hopefully that will change.
Well, as you said, it might be changing more from this week, from the sound of it, a little bit of it.
Let's hope, yeah.
Yeah. And while we've got time for a few more questions, but I guess it was somebody called Sophia, I'm not sure where she works, sent me a private message too. She's trying to watch a 1-year-old, which we all understand is difficult. She was asking about what's the best way, or how do you prefer to be contacted at the moment? So I guess that is through email, but is it Twitter too? Is it, how is it?
No, it is not Twitter. Oh God. So I don't know who came up with this idea of like posting something on Twitter and tagging reporters on it. It's a disaster. I've had like people I have very good relations with do it to me, and then they kind of get retweeted for days, and my notifications column gets completely inundated with their notifications to their post that I didn't ask for. I find it incredibly irritating. I think email's the best. I hate cold calls. And being tagged on Twitter posts, it just does my head in. So definitely email. I read all my emails, which is like sometimes I have no idea how that happens. Like I think I get more than 100 a day, and that's not counting texts and stuff. So yeah, definitely email. I really like, honestly, this Twitter thing, it has to stop.
Thank you for that. I bet lots of people do that. I'll pass over to Joe.
Yeah, I don't know. I have done that in the past myself, but that's only tagging a journalist. But they're only the ones who tell me, like, I'm not picking up my email. I'm in the middle of an event or a press conference. They just like send me a PM, like personal message on Twitter. I guess that's a bit different from tagging. Because
yeah, that's different. DMs are fine. I don't really read long DMs. I've removed Twitter from my phone for mental health reasons. So yeah, DMs I think are different.
Yeah, exactly. So the way to reach you normally is email, but if there's a massive event going along, like a real, like you're in this mix of something, then the best way is to send a tweet, not a tweet, I mean a text message, or what?
No, like unless I've personally given you my phone, don't call me, don't text me.
Oh, of course, yeah. Would only assume that you've
everything is on the same device, you know. So like, I'll get your email immediately.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, everybody. So email it is. Don't hassle the poor journalists who are already overworked and underpaid, probably. Like it's a tough business, journalism these days. I've got a couple of questions about sourcing, you know, because, you know, one thing is like the stories you want to write, and the other thing is the stories that people pitch to you, right? I mean, and anybody can be pitching you through your email a story. And of course, doing exclusives is much better than just like churning out a press release, which then goes to 2,000 people, which most people just never read, actually. So that's one thing for people on the call to bear in mind, to be a little bit more targeted, know your journalist a bit better, you know, do a bit of research. So it kind of makes sense, the pitch. I've got a question here from Isabel from CEPS, which is the policy Center for European Policy Studies, just to be really posh and correct. So called an independent European think tank undertaking research on most European policy areas and many of the topics you mentioned. Oof. So the question from Izzy is, do you often engage with think tanks and their research? And if so, in which ways? Thank you.
Great. Okay. A really great question, because actually we are quite different in how we do that to other organizations that have a big presence in Brussels. So yes, and I've actually moderated and participated in events at SEPS and have a long history of working with them. A lot of think tanks at the moment are coming to us and pitching us with, SEPS actually hasn't been doing this, but they come to us and pitch with us with like exclusive first view of so-and-so's paper on this policy area. We don't really do that. Where I find think tanks and their research really, really useful is two things. One, come to me and say, Matina, I've noticed you write about X, Y, and Z. I have these 3 really sharp thinkers who are available at short notice to talk to you on these matters. And if they're women, and if they are not, sort of the sort of voices you hear every day from the incredibly male-wide dominated space of think tanks in Brussels, you are pushing through open doors. I am desperate to diversify the number and background of people I talk to on the issues that I cover. And I'm eternally grateful when I know that I have 3 or 4 analysts who are really sharp thinkers and respond quickly on newsy days, but also are available to talk through more complex issues for stories that require more research. The other way that I engage with think tanks and find think tanks in Brussels incredibly useful is research that brings something new to the table that normally requires their number crunching. We have done this number crunching and we found XYZ that's surprising or interesting, or that type of research analysis that illuminates a part of a theme or a story or a policy area that we cover regularly. And that's sort of something that I can add to my story to make it richer, to make it, to differentiate it from what other people are writing on the same topic. So on both those, in both those ways, I find the work that the think tanks do in Brussels really, really important and interesting. Unfortunately, now that we can't physical meetings, we missed the third really great thing about Brussels think tanks, which is networking before and after events. But insofar as we can recreate that online, that's really great.
Well, thank you very much. We are drawing to the end of this, and indeed this is why we're trying to hold these sort of things online. It's definitely not as it usually is, where now we'd all try to gather in the kitchen at the European Environmental Bureau and have a glass of wine or a Diet Coke, but we will do that in the future indeed. Now, I think we've got all of the questions answered, which is great. Joe, I don't know if you had another question to add, but otherwise, do you have anything else to add?
I'm good right now, but I would just say my question is, well, it's not really a question. Let's have a martini once this thing is over, right? Face to face. Let's do it.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Or 3.
Yeah, no, but thank you very, very much, Matina. That was really a great session, and many people are saying just the same thing in the chat here. So thank you so much for talking to us about that. And I'm delighted it's also on a day when, perhaps there's the COVID-19 pandemic has obviously affected all sorts of different issues around the world, just as you said, and different groups of people that we work with and so on. But it's really good to get that wide perspective about how you're working at the moment and how we can get our issues better covered. So thank you. And on that note, we've also recorded some of this. So normally we started a little late, but most of it. And so we can send that also to the participants, if that's okay with Matina. And then I'll just pass to Joe for details of the next session. Thanks very much.
Yeah, let's do 3. Absolutely. Absolutely. So thank you so much, Matina. It's really fascinating. I'm so sorry you can't see me, but you'll see me over that martini one of these days. Great work you're doing. Great work the paper is doing as well. Thanks so much, Julia, for fixing this today. Really nice to meet you and see you both smiling at me. We had 100 or so signed up. We had pretty much 50 on the call. So many positive reactions in the chat. Matina, lots of appreciation for sharing your insights, taking time out of your busy day, professionally and personally, to share insights with us. I just wanted to say that our next event is happening, it's already arranged. How efficient are we? On June the 22nd, 4 p.m. And it's on search engine optimization, like from the newsroom to the digital search engine. So during lockdown, online visibility has become a huge priority as conferences and in-person meetings have been cancelled. 93%, according to our speaker, of all online experiences start with a search engine. So if you aren't showing up there, you are invisible. How about that? So the guy who's going to share his insights with us, he's head of digital at a big agency in Brussels called Edelman. His name is Rowan Emsley. He has a background working in NGOs on digital content. He went then into the world of digital marketing for several startups in Nairobi and Berlin. And he's going to join us and share his insights focused on that. And that's something we can all learn from, I think. So make a note of that. That's Monday, I think 22nd of June at 4 o'clock, same space. Hopefully I'll have my camera fixed by then. I hope so, because I have a whole week ahead, as usual, of back-to-back Zoom meetings. So I'm so sorry you didn't see me today, but hey, I can see you all, which is great. And again, Matina, thank you so much. Thank you all at home for joining us, and raise a glass if we're allowed to. If we don't have children, I don't have mine right now, so I can actually have a drink, but I have a whole set of work to do this evening. But anyway, enjoy, those of you who can raise a glass. Have a bit of booze. I can see some nice smiley faces at the top. So all cameras on, wave goodbye. I can't, but I can see you all. So see you next time. Thanks, Matina. Thanks, Julia. Bye, everybody.
Thank you very much. Oh, that's nice to see everyone.